Tonight's story comes from a man I picked up on a forgotten stretch of highway, a former night guard running from a job that never officially existed. Hello, and welcome to Night Drive Stories. My name's Jack, and I drive the silent highways of the Pacific Northwest long after midnight, picking up those who wander these misty roads. Tonight, let me tell you the story I heard from the stranger I picked up just outside the old truck stop at mile marker 99. But before, if you like these eerie stories about the lost wanderers I meet along the way, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel. The man I found was standing just past the sickly orange glow of the gas station sign, a thin silhouette against a wall of impenetrable black pine trees. His thumb was out, but it was a half-hearted gesture, as if he expected no one to stop. He looked worn, not by the road, but by something deeper. He threw a threadbare duffel bag in the back and slumped into the passenger seat, the smell of rain and old fear clinging to him. He didn't say much for the first 20 miles, just stared out at the ribbon of asphalt unwinding in my headlights. "You running from something or running to something?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He gave a dry, rattling laugh. "Both," he said, his voice raspy. "And I don't think there's a difference anymore." He finally turned to look at me, his eyes hollowed out. "You want to hear a story, driver? About a job I took. A job that doesn't exist in a place that's not on any map." I just nodded, and as the pines grew thicker and the fog began to creep in from the shoulders of the highway, he began to speak. "It all started with the damp," he began, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them, though the cab was heated. "Not the Oregon damp you get in the winter, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you feel your age. This was a different kind. It was the damp of desperation. The kind you feel when you're down to your last $43 and rent is a week away. It was in my apartment, this cheap little studio in a town called Havenwood, a place that was anything but. It was in the peeling wallpaper, in the perpetually wet bath mat, in the sour smell of the clothes I couldn't afford to wash. That's the feeling that pushes a man to do things he wouldn't otherwise. Havenwood was one of those timber towns that the timber industry had long since forgotten. It was a place of permanent overcast, both in the sky and in the faces of the people who were stuck there. I was one of them. My truck had been repossessed, my girl had left, and my credit was so shot I couldn't have financed a candy bar. I spent my days scanning job boards for anything, warehouse work, logging, anything, nothing. The whole region felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to exhale its last resident. That's when I saw the flyer. It was tacked to the grease-stained corkboard at the Dip and Dine, the only 24-hour diner in town. It was out of place. Most of the other notices were for lost cats or used lawnmowers, faded and curling at the edges. This one was fresh, printed on thick cream-colored cardstock. The text was simple, almost stark. "Night watchman. Secluded private property. Excellent pay, cash weekly. No experience necessary. Discretion is paramount. Call Mr. Alistair." There was a phone number. No company name, no address. Just that. It felt odd. Discretion is paramount isn't a phrase you see on a flyer for a simple security gig, and excellent pay in a town like Havenwood was an outright fantasy. My first thought was that it was some kind of scam, or worse, something illegal. But then I felt that damp again, the cold dread of eviction, of having absolutely nowhere to go. What did I have to lose? I called the number from the payphone outside the diner. A voice answered on the first ring, a voice as dry and brittle as autumn leaves. "Alistair." It wasn't a question. I told him I was calling about the job. There was a long pause, so long I thought he'd hung up. Then he just said, "Dip and Dine." 1 hour, and the line went dead. An hour later, I was sitting in a cracked vinyl booth nursing a cup of burnt coffee when he walked in. The bell over the door didn't jingle. I swear it didn't. One moment the doorway was empty, the next he was there, standing like a scarecrow someone had propped up. He was tall, impossibly thin, wearing a threadbare but well-tailored black suit that looked 50 years out of date. His face was all sharp angles and sunken hollows, his skin the color of old parchment. He moved toward my booth with a slow, deliberate gait, his eyes fixed on me. They were the palest gray, like a winter sky bled of all color. "Mr. Leo?" he asked, though I hadn't given him my name. He slid into the booth opposite me, not making a sound. He didn't order anything. He just sat there, his long skeletal fingers steepled on the tabletop, and watched me. "That's me," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "You're Mr. Alistair?" He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "The position is for a night watchman. The property is approximately 40 minutes east of town. It is remote. Your shift would be from sunset to sunrise, 4 nights a week. The pay is $500 per shift, in cash." I almost choked on my coffee. $2,000 a week, in cash, for a night watchman job? That was more than I'd ever made in a month. The alarm bells in my head were screaming, but the thought of that money was a siren song, drowning them out. "What's the property?" I asked, my voice a little shaky. "A warehouse? Some rich guy's estate?" Alistair's gaze didn't waver. "It is a private garden, a place of repose. Your duties are simple. You will be provided with a small guard shack at the main gate. You are to remain there for the duration of your shift. You are to ensure the gate remains locked. You are to be a presence. That is all." It sounded too easy. It was the definition of too good to be true. "A presence? You're paying me $2,000 a week just to sit there?" "Your presence is the service," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "But your employment is contingent on 3 rules. They are absolute. They are not to be questioned or broken. If you break them, your employment is terminated immediately, without pay. Do you understand?" I nodded slowly. "Okay. What are the rules?" He leaned forward, just a fraction, and the air grew cold. His pale eyes seemed to look right through me. "Rule number 1, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You do not, for any reason, leave the interior of the guard shack between sunset and sunrise. Not to stretch your legs, not to relieve yourself. There is a chemical toilet for that, not for anything. Once that sun is gone, you are inside until it returns." I swallowed hard. "Okay. Rule number 2. The shack has 2 light switches. One for the interior bulb, one for the exterior floodlights that illuminate the grounds. You are forbidden from ever activating the exterior lights. They are not for you to use. They must remain off." This was getting stranger by the second. "Why even have them then?" "You are not paid to ask why, Mr. Leo," Alistair said, his voice like chipping ice. "You are paid to obey. Do you accept the condition?" "Yeah, okay. And rule number 3. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was humming with tension. "This is the most important. You may, on occasion, see people on the grounds, beyond the gate. You may hear things, voices. You are to never, under any circumstances, acknowledge or communicate with them. You do not speak to them. You do not open the gate for them. You do not respond in any way. To you, they do not exist. You are a watchman in a box. Nothing outside that box is your concern. Is that clear?" My mind was racing. Trespassers, vagrants. This was starting to sound dangerous. What if they try to get in? Should I call the cops? For the first time, something flickered in Alistair's dead eyes. It looked almost like amusement. "The local authorities are unaware of the property. They will not come. And the people you may see have no interest in getting in. Your only responsibility is to ignore them. See them as phantoms, tricks of the light." He leaned back, the moment broken. "Those are the terms. Sunset to sunrise, stay in the shack, no floodlights, speak to no one. If you can do that, the job is yours. Your first payment will be waiting for you in the shack tonight." I should have walked away. Every instinct in my body was telling me to get up and run out of that diner and never look back. But I saw the peeling wallpaper in my apartment. I smelled the sour dampness of my life. I felt the cold, hard reality of $43. What choice did I really have? "I'll do it," I said. Alistair's mouth formed a thin, bloodless line that might have been a smile. "Excellent." He slid a small, hand-drawn map across the table, along with a single ornate iron key. "The map will lead you to the service road. It is unmarked. The key is for the main gate and the shack. Be there before the sun sets." He stood up, as silent as he had arrived. For a moment, He just looked down at me, his expression unreadable. "One last piece of advice, Mr. Leo. The rules are not for our protection. They are for yours." And with that, he turned and walked out of the Dip and Dine. The bell above the door, once again, remained silent. The drive out there was an exercise in peeling back the layers of the world. The hitcher continued, his eyes fixed on the rain-slicked road ahead. The map was crude, but accurate. It took me off the main highway, onto a county road that was more patch than pavement, and then onto a gravel lane I would have missed entirely if I hadn't been looking for it. The final instruction was to turn onto a dirt track marked by a dead pine tree split by lightning. It felt less like a direction and more like an omen. The trees closed in around my beat-up sedan, their branches clawing at the windows. The sun was setting fast, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed like living things. By the time I reached the end of the track, the world had been reduced to shades of gray and purple. And there it was, a wrought iron fence, at least 10 feet high, topped with cruel-looking spikes. It was rusted, ancient, and choked with ivy, but it looked unnervingly solid. In the center was a double gate, chained and padlocked. A small, tarnished brass plaque was half hidden by weeds. I had to get out and push the foliage aside to read the engraved script. St. Jude's Garden of Repose. St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. I felt a bitter laugh catch in my throat. The key Alistair had given me was cold and heavy. It slid into the old, monstrous lock with a grating sound that echoed in the twilight stillness. The gate groaned open just enough for me to slip my car through, and I locked it behind me, the definitive clank of the padlock sealing me in. The guard shack was just inside, a small cinder-block cube with a single grimy window facing the grounds. It was as charmless and grim as Alistair himself. Inside, it was bare except for a wooden chair, a small desk with a locked drawer, and the chemical toilet Alistair had mentioned. On the desk was a thermos of what smelled like coffee, a brown paper bag with 2 stale-looking sandwiches, and a thick white envelope. I ripped it open. Inside were 5 crisp $100 bills. Seeing the money made it real, and for a moment, it calmed the frantic beating in my chest. This was just a job. A weird job, sure, but a job. I settled into the chair as the last sliver of sun vanished behind the jagged line of the pines. The darkness that fell wasn't just the absence of light. It was a presence. It was heavy, smothering. I flipped the switch for the interior light, and the shack was filled with the hum of a single naked yellow bulb. Outside the cemetery, the garden, was a vague sea of deeper blacks and grays. My first hour was spent fighting off waves of paranoia. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, was a potential threat. I kept my eyes glued to the window. I couldn't see much, just the vague shapes of headstones marching away into the darkness. But there was something wrong with them. Even in the gloom, I could tell they weren't uniform. Some were tall, others were squat and wide. They were arranged in no discernible pattern, no neat rows, just a chaotic jumble that seemed to defy any sense of order. The layout felt wrong, intentionally confusing, like a maze designed to trap you. As my eyes adjusted, I started to make out more detail on the closest stones. They weren't smooth marble or granite. They looked rough-hewn, almost primitive. And the carvings, they weren't angels or lambs. From what I could tell, they were faces. Not peaceful, beatific faces in repose, but faces contorted in what looked like agony, mouths open in silent, eternal screams. The sight sent a cold shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. The silence was the next thing that got to me. It was absolute. No crickets, no owls, no distant hum of the highway. It was a dead, vacuum-sealed silence that pressed in on my eardrums. It was the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, the blood rushing in your ears. It felt unnatural, as if the entire forest for miles around was holding its breath. Around what I guessed was 2 a.m., I started to drift off, my head lolling against the cold glass of the window. And that's when I heard it. It was faint at first, carried on the night breeze. The sound of a child crying. My head snapped up. I was instantly awake, my heart pounding. I strained to listen. pressing my ear to the glass. There it was again, closer this time. A thin, reedy sob filled with a heartbreaking sorrow. It was coming from out there, in the darkness, somewhere among the screaming headstones. My first instinct, my most basic human instinct, was to help. A kid, lost in the woods, in a creepy old cemetery in the middle of the night. I had to do something. I stood up, my hand already reaching for the doorknob. My fingers brushed the cold metal, and Alistair's voice echoed in my head, as clear as if he were standing beside me. Rule number 1. You do not, for any reason, leave the interior of the guard shack. I froze. It had to be a test. It had to be. Maybe Alistair was out there himself, with a tape recorder, seeing if the new guy would follow the rules. It was a cruel, sick test, but it was the only explanation that made any sense. The crying grew more desperate. "Mama! Mama! Where are you? I'm scared!" It was a little boy's voice. It sounded so real, so terrified. My resolve wavered. This was insane. What kind of person hears a child in distress and does nothing? I looked at the door, then at the desolate black expanse beyond the window. I imagined a small boy, tripping over roots, lost and alone. Then I imagined Alistair, his pale, disappointed eyes. And I remembered the $2,000 a week. What was more real? The abstract terror of a lost child, or the concrete promise of survival? I backed away from the door and sat back down in the chair, my body trembling. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound. But it went on, for what felt like an eternity, pleading, sobbing, calling for a mother who would never answer. It was a direct assault on my conscience. Each sob felt like a physical blow. I was a monster, sitting in my little box of light doing nothing. Just as I thought I couldn't take another second of it, it stopped. Not faded away, but cut off, as if someone had flicked a switch. The profound, dead silence rushed back in, even more oppressive than before. I spent the rest of the night rigid in my chair, staring out into the blackness, my coffee untouched. When the first hint of gray finally appeared on the horizon, it felt like a resurrection. As the sun rose, painting the sky in glorious shades of pink and orange, it felt like I had survived something more than just a boring night shift. As the light spilled over the grounds, I saw there was no one there. No lost child, no footprints in the damp earth near the gate. Nothing. Just before I left, my curiosity got the better of me. I walked a few feet past the shack, just to get a better look at the nearest headstones in the morning light. I noticed names, deeply and crudely carved into the stone beneath the screaming faces. The names were old-fashioned: Jedediah, Hephzibah, Ebenezer, and under each name was a town, Penance. Every single one of them was from a place called Penance. I'd lived in Oregon my whole life, prided myself on knowing the back roads and ghost towns. I had never, ever heard of a town called Penance. "You might think a man would quit after a night like that," he said, taking a long drag from an imaginary cigarette. His hands were shaking slightly. I should have. I know that now. I should have taken the $500, driven until my car ran out of gas and never looked back. But $2,000 a week, that kind of money buys a lot of forgetting. It builds a wall between you and your fear, at least for a little while. So I went back. Night after night, the routine became a strange sort of penance of my own. Drive the lonely road, unlock the groaning gate, seal myself in the cinder block box, and wait for the sun. I got used to the silence. I got used to the screaming faces on the headstones. I even, to my shame, got used to the crying. It wasn't there every night, but it came back often enough. The lost little boy, wailing in the dark. I learned to turn up the volume on the small, crackly AM radio I brought with me, drowning him out with late-night talk shows and forgotten music. I told myself it was a recording. It had to be. A psychological trick to test my obedience. The real test, however, was yet to come. It was about my 5th or 6th week on the job. A thick, wet fog rolled in just after sunset, blanketing everything. It was a classic Pacific Northwest fog, so dense it felt like you could chew on it. It swallowed the weak light from my shack, pressing right up against the window pane, blurring the world outside into a swirl of gray. The fog muted everything. Even the oppressive silence seemed deeper, heavier. I was reading an old paperback, trying to keep my mind occupied, when a flicker of movement at the very edge of my vision made me look up. I stared out into the soupy haze. Nothing, just the faint, ghostly outlines of the nearest graves. I told myself it was a trick of the light, my eyes playing games on me in the monochrome twilight. I went back to my book, but I couldn't focus. A new kind of unease was prickling at the back of my neck. Then I saw it again. Not a flicker this time. A definite shape. A man, standing motionless beside one of the contorted headstones, maybe 50 yards out. He was just a silhouette, a cutout in the fog, tall and thin. He was unnaturally still, not just calm, but perfectly, rigidly motionless like a statue. I watched him for a full 5 minutes, my breath held tight in my chest. He didn't move a muscle. He didn't shiver in the cold. He didn't shift his weight. He just stood there facing my shack. I couldn't make out any features, just his dark, still form. I felt a primal fear grip me. This wasn't a trespasser. A trespasser would move, would use a flashlight, would be trying to do something. This figure was just watching. Alistair's third rule slammed into my mind. You may, on occasion, see people on the grounds. You are to never, under any circumstances, acknowledge or communicate with them. My heart hammered against my ribs. This is what he meant. This is what he was warning me about. As I kept staring, another shape materialized out of the fog to the left of the first one, and then another to the right. Soon there were half a dozen of them, all standing in perfect stillness, all facing my little shack. They were like chess pieces set up on a board, silent and waiting. They didn't feel human. They felt like markers, placeholders for something dreadful. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my chair, turned away from the window, radio turned up to full volume, trying not to think about the silent audience that had gathered in the fog. When the sun finally burned the mist away, they were gone. Of course they were. The experience rattled me badly, but the true horror came 2 nights later. The fog was gone, replaced by a cold, clear night with a sliver of moon that made the screaming headstones gleam with a sickly, pale light. It was just after midnight when the headlights cut through the darkness, coming down the service road. My blood ran cold. No one was supposed to know this road. I ducked down instinctively, peering over the edge of the windowsill. A battered old station wagon, the kind with fake wood paneling, pulled up to the gate and stopped. The engine cut out, and the sudden return of the absolute silence was deafening. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then the driver's side door opened and a woman got out. She was thin, wearing a simple house dress despite the cold. Her blonde hair was a mess. She walked right up to the gate, her hands gripping the cold iron bars. Even from a distance, I could see the desperation on her face. It was the face of every parent in their worst nightmare. "Hello?" she called out, her voice thin and panicked. "Please, is anyone there? My son! I think he wandered in here." My stomach twisted into a knot. The crying child, the lost boy. It was all connected. It wasn't a recording. It was a lure. And this was the next step in the trap. My mind was screaming. Don't talk to her. Rule number 3. Don't acknowledge her. "Please," she cried, her voice breaking with a sob. "His name is Daniel. He just ran off. He's only 7. I saw the gate was open. Please, you have to help me." She looked so real, so utterly, convincingly terrified. The grief in her voice was a physical thing. My hand hovered over the small intercom button Alistair had told me was only for emergency contact with him. Every decent part of me wanted to press it, to tell her I'd call for help, to reassure her. But Alistair's face, gaunt and serious, swam in my memory. To you, they do not exist. I stayed silent. I didn't move. I just watched, my heart breaking for her. Her pleading continued for several minutes, growing more and more frantic. Then her tone began to shift. The desperation began to curdle, replaced by an edge of impatience. "I know you're in there," she said, her voice hardening. The sorrow was evaporating, replaced by something cold and sharp. "I can see your light. Open this gate now." The change was so sudden, so jarring, it was like a mask had slipped. The grieving mother was gone. The thing wearing her face was looking directly at my shack. Its eyes, which I could now see glinting in the moonlight, were no longer filled with tears, but with a chilling, predatory hunger. "Let me in," she hissed, her voice dropping to a low, guttural snarl that was not human. She rattled the gate, the sound echoing violently in the night. The strength in her was terrifying. The thick iron bars shuddered under her assault. I scrambled back from the window, falling out of my chair and landing hard on the concrete floor. I lay there, trembling, listening to her rage. She wasn't screaming for her son anymore. She was screaming at me, vile, hateful things, promises of what she would do if I didn't open the gate. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I risked a glance over the sill. The station wagon was gone. The woman was gone. There was nothing but the silent gate and the pale, screaming headstones under the moon. My shift wouldn't end for another 5 hours. It was the longest 5 hours of my life. I knew, with a certainty that went deeper than bone, that I wasn't just a guard. I was a gatekeeper, and the things I was keeping in were not the dead. Jack's voice cut through the hitchhiker's story, low and steady. "What did Alistair say about this? You must have told him." The man shook his head, a quick, jerky motion. "You think a man like Alistair wants to hear your problems? His whole deal was predicated on me not asking questions. Telling him his phantoms were rattling the gate and threatening to peel my skin off didn't feel like a path to continued employment. No, I knew talking to him was a dead end. I had to find answers on my own, and I had a feeling they were close. In that shack with me, every night, in that locked desk drawer." He took a breath and continued his tale. "The night after my encounter with the woman, the thing pretending to be a woman, I came to my shift with a purpose. Along with my sandwiches and radio, I brought a small crowbar. The fear of Alistair finding out was nothing compared to the terror of not knowing what I was dealing with. The thought of spending another night in that box, blind and ignorant, was impossible. As soon as the sun dipped below the horizon and the suffocating darkness returned, I went to work. The lock on the desk drawer was old, but sturdy. It took me a good 10 minutes of frantic, sweaty prying, the screech of protesting metal sounding like a gunshot in the dead silence. Every sound had me glancing nervously out the window, expecting to see the woman's furious face pressed against the glass, or the silent men standing judgment among the graves. But there was nothing. Just the night, waiting. Finally, with a loud crack, the wood splintered and the drawer gave way. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely aim my flashlight inside. It was mostly empty. Some old paperwork, dried up pens, a spare set of keys for something. And underneath it all, a large leather-bound book. It was a ledger, the kind you see in old black and white movies. The leather was cracked and dark with age, the corners worn smooth. There was no title on the cover. I lifted it out. It was heavy, substantial. It felt like it was weighted with history. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was an elegant, almost calligraphic script, faded but legible. The entry was dated October 31st, 1888. My blood went cold. This book was over a century old. My first night as watchman, the entry began. "Father says the repose is quiet now. The ritual is complete. They are planted. He says my duty is simple, to be a presence, to keep the soil from growing restless. The silence is profound. It is not a holy silence." I flipped through the pages. It was a logbook, a watchman's diary, passed down from one guard to the next. For the first few decades, the entries were sparse, written by the same hand. They noted strange weather patterns, an unnatural stillness in the air, the way sound seemed to die as soon as it left your lips. Then, in the early 1920s, the handwriting changed. The new guard was more descriptive, more unnerved. "Heard the crying again tonight," one entry read. "The boy. Father warned me of the lure, but the sound of it chills the soul. It is a sorrow so deep it feels like it's coming from the ground itself. I must remember it is a falsehood. It is bait." I felt a shock of recognition. The crying child wasn't a recent test for me. It was part of the fabric of this place, a trap that had been set for generations. I kept reading, my earlier fear being replaced by a kind of obsessive, horrified fascination. Page after page, a secret history of this place unfolded. Different guards, different decades, same story. They all wrote about the figures. They called them the silent choir. They all wrote about the visitors, people showing up at the gate with desperate stories trying to trick their way in. One guard in the 1950s described a man claiming to be from the county, needing to inspect the property lines. Another, in the 70s, wrote about a young couple whose car had conveniently broken down right outside the gate. As the years went on, the tone of the entries grew more desperate. The handwriting became more scrawled, more frantic. April 12, 1985. The ground hums tonight. I can feel it through the soles of my shoes, a low, constant vibration. The choir is more numerous than I have ever seen them. They are not standing still. They are swaying. A slow, rhythmic sway, like weeds at the bottom of a river. They are waiting for something. June 3, 1999. The whispers have started. Not from the gate, but from the shack itself. Faint, sibilant sounds in the walls, in the floor. They know my name. I haven't spoken my name aloud since I took this post. I flipped towards the end of the book, my fingers trembling. The last few entries were from the man who held the job right before me. His name was Miller, and his handwriting was a barely legible scrawl, full of crossed-out words and ink blots, as if the pen were shaking uncontrollably in his hand. His first few entries were like mine, confused, scared, but determined. Then they unraveled. They know what I love. The woman at the gate tonight. She had my wife's face. My dead wife's face. God help me, for a second I believed her. I reached for the latch. The next entry was just a few days later. It was the last one in the book. It was scrawled diagonally across the entire page, the pen pressed so hard it had torn through the paper in places. It's a garden. Alistair wasn't lying, but you don't bury things in a garden. You plant them, you tend them, you help them grow. We are not guards, we are nourishment. They're not buried here, they're planted. Don't let them wake up. Planted. The word echoed the first entry from 1888, a garden of repose. My stomach heaved. I felt an overwhelming urge to be sick. This wasn't a cemetery, it was a farm. And whatever they were growing, we were the fertilizer. Shaking, I put the ledger down. My flashlight beam fell back into the drawer, illuminating something small and metallic I'd missed. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age. I pried it open. Inside were two tiny, faded photographs. On one side was a stern-looking man with a thick mustache and the kind of hard eyes you saw in 19th century portraits. On the other, my breath hitched in my throat. On the other side was a young woman with blonde hair and a soft, sad smile. It was the woman from the gate. The woman who had claimed to be looking for her son, Daniel. Her face, young and innocent and human, stared up at me from another century. And with dawning absolute horror, I realized she wasn't a lure. She was a resident. Finding that ledger, seeing her face in the locket, it broke something in me, the hitchhiker said, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. The fragile wall I'd built between the job and my sanity crumbled to dust. This wasn't about money anymore. This wasn't about just surviving until sunrise. I was part of something monstrous, an unwitting accomplice to a horror that stretched back over 100 years. The questions were a swarm of angry hornets in my head. What was planted here? Who were these people from the town of Penance? And what in God's name did Miller mean by nourishment? I knew I couldn't go on. I couldn't sit in that shack for one more night without answers. My next cash pickup was in 2 days, at the same derelict diner where I'd first met Alistair. I spent those 2 days in a fugue state, the ledger hidden under the mattress in my grimy apartment. I barely slept. When I did, my dreams were of dark soil and shifting roots, of whispers calling my name from deep underground. I walked into the dip and dine with the ledger clutched in a canvas bag under my arm. Alistair was already there, sitting in the same booth, a wraith in a black suit. He had a white envelope on the table in front of him. He looked at me, and his pale eyes seemed to register the change in me immediately. The fear, the ignorance, it was gone. replaced by a hard, brittle anger. "You look unwell, Mr. Leo," he said, his voice as dry as bone dust. "I quit," I said, my voice shaking but firm. I slid into the booth opposite him. "And you're gonna tell me what the hell is going on at that place?" He didn't seem surprised. He simply gave a slow, weary sigh. "The terms of your employment were clear. No questions." "The terms have changed," I said. I pulled the heavy ledger from my bag and slammed it onto the table between us. It landed with a solid, definitive thud. I found the company logbook, Jedediah Miller, 100 years of guards driven mad. I know about the choir, I know about the lures at the gate, and I know about penance. Alistair stared at the book. For the first time, an emotion crossed his parchment-like features. It wasn't anger or fear, it was a profound, ancient weariness, as if he were carrying the weight of all the years recorded in that book. He reached out a long, skeletal finger and traced the worn leather of the cover. "My great-grandfather wrote the first entry," he said softly, his voice losing its icy edge and taking on a tone of somber resignation. "His name was Charles Alistair. He was not a watchman. He was the town doctor in penance." He finally looked up at me, his gaze holding mine. "There is no money for you, Mr. Leo. You broke the rules. But since you have disturbed the archives, you deserve to know what duty you have abandoned." He leaned back, and the story spilled out of him, not like a confession, but like a recitation, a tale he had told himself 1,000 times in the dark. "Penance wasn't a ghost town," he began. "It did not succumb to fire or famine. It committed suicide. The town was founded on a silver mine, but the miners found something else in the deep earth. Not a mineral. A presence. An intelligence. Something vast and sleeping." The hairs on my arms stood on end. This was the cosmic horror I'd only read about in pulp novels, being told to me over greasy formica. "A man came to town," Alistair continued, "a charismatic preacher who called himself the Shepherd. He convinced the people of penance that the thing in the earth was a god, a chthonic deity that predated humanity. He taught them that flesh was a cage, that mortality was a disease. He promised them a way to transcend, to shed their bodies and join their consciousness with the God in the earth, to become part of its eternal dream." He paused, his eyes distant. "My great-grandfather tried to warn them. He saw it for what it was. A death cult, pure and simple. But they wouldn't listen. On All Hallows Eve, 1888, the entire town of Penance, over 200 souls, gathered in that valley. The shepherd led them in one final blasphemous ritual. They didn't just kill themselves, Mr. Leo. They offered themselves. They believed they were planting the seeds of a new divine consciousness on earth. So the headstones," I whispered, the image of the screaming faces flashing in my mind. "The headstones are markers, yes. But they are also locks," Alistair said. "My great-grandfather, a few loyal men. They couldn't stop the ritual, but they could try to contain the aftermath. They performed their own rites, old rites, binding rites, to seal the ground, to turn their garden of ascension into a prison of slumber. The cemetery, the fence, the gate, it's all part of a containment apparatus." "And the guards?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Miller said we were nourishment. Alistair nodded slowly. "The entity slumbers, but it is not dead. It dreams. And in its dreams, the consciousnesses of the penance townsfolk, the choir, as you call them, are echoes, phantoms. They are restless. The presence of a living, breathing human mind nearby. A quiet, contained, non-interactive mind. It acts as a sort of psychic dampener, a lullaby. It soothes the restless dreams and keeps the greater entity dormant. Your presence, your life force, your quiet attention. It feeds the slumber. It keeps the prison secure." It was insane. My job was to be a human lullaby for a sleeping god. A psychic scarecrow. "But it's waking up, isn't it?" I said, thinking of the humming ground, the swaying choir. The whispers, the woman at the gate. "It's getting stronger." Alistair's face grew grim. "The seal weakens with every passing year. The dreams become more vivid, more powerful. The echoes learn. They create more elaborate lures, like the woman with the locket. Hephzibah, her name was. One of the first to follow the shepherd. They test the boundaries. They test the warden. By the warden? My family, Alistair said, a flicker of something like pride in his dead eyes. We are the wardens of St. Jude's. We have watched over this place for 4 generations. We find the watchmen. We pay them. We enforce the rules. It is our sacred, awful duty. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to an intense, urgent whisper. You cannot quit, Mr. Leo. Miller quit. He broke. And in the 3 weeks before we could find you, the ground grew more restless than it had been in 50 years. Your presence has calmed it. If you leave now, if the garden is left untended for too long, the humming will become a roar, the whispers will become a voice, and the dream will end. Something will wake up, something that believes the entire world is its flesh. I just stared at him, the greasy smell of the diner fading away, replaced by the scent of damp earth and deep cosmic dread. He wasn't just my employer, he was a jailer. And he was telling me my job was to sit on top of a psychic prison that was about to have a riot, and sing it to sleep with my soul. He slid the envelope of cash across the table. It wasn't my severance. It was my next payment, a retainer. Your shift starts at sunset, Mr. Leo, he said. Do not be late. I took the money, the man said, his voice now just a hollow rasp in the dark cab of my truck. God help me. I took the money and I went back. What else could I do? Alistair had laid it all out. This wasn't a job anymore. It was a duty. A terrible, insane duty. I was a finger in a dike holding back a black ocean of madness. The thought of what would happen if I abandoned my post was more terrifying than the thought of returning to it. But knowing the truth didn't make it easier. It made it infinitely worse. Every night I spent in that shack after my talk with Alistair was a masterclass in psychological torture. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the knowledge of the slumbering God beneath my feet. The screaming faces on the headstones were no longer just creepy carvings. They were the last expressions of the damned souls who had planted themselves in this unholy ground. And the whispers, they got worse. Before, they were just sounds in the walls. Now they were coherent. They knew the truth. I knew. They didn't call my name anymore. They used the knowledge against me. We are lonely, Leo, they would hiss, the sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. The warden starves us. A little attention, a little conversation, is that so much to ask? The figures, the silent choir, were no longer content to stand still. They moved. They drifted through the fog like wraiths, their feet never seeming to touch the ground. Sometimes they would press themselves up against the iron fence, their featureless faces turned toward my light. I could see the outlines of their forms more clearly now. Men in old-fashioned suits, women in long dresses, the townsfolk of penance, their spectral echoes clawing at the edges of their prison. The crying of the lost boy became unbearable. I knew it was a lure, a phantom, but the sound was engineered to break a human heart. Sometimes a new voice would join it, a woman's voice humming a lullaby. Hephzibah, the woman from the locket. Her song was beautiful and filled with a sorrow so profound it felt like it could crack the world open. It was a siren song, promising peace and an end to suffering. If only I would open the gate. I was unraveling. The 4 nights a week felt like a continuous, unending shift. I stopped sleeping during the day. My apartment became a place of dread. The silence there just a pale echo of the deeper silence at the garden. I lost weight. My hands had a permanent tremor. I was being eroded, my life force, my nourishment, siphoned away to keep the nightmare asleep. I felt like a battery being slowly drained to power a single dim bulb in an infinite darkness. I knew I was going to end up like Miller, a mad scrawl on the last page of a book. My last night came about a month after I'd spoken to Alistair. A storm was brewing all day, the sky a bruised purple-gray. By the time I got to the cemetery, the wind was howling through the pines, a low, mournful sound. The rain started just after sunset, not a drizzle, but a torrential biblical downpour. It hammered against the roof of the shack and streamed down the window pane, turning the world outside into a distorted liquid nightmare. The storm seemed to agitate the garden. The whispers were louder than ever. a chorus of sibilant demands that rode on the wind. Then, around midnight, it happened. A massive bolt of lightning struck nearby, a blinding flash of white that lit up the entire cemetery for a split second, followed by a crack of thunder so loud it shook the shack to its foundations, and the power went out. My single yellow bulb died. The radio went silent. I was plunged into absolute terrifying darkness. The only light was the intermittent, strobe-like flash of the lightning, each one revealing a horrifying tableau of the swaying choir, their forms clearer than ever, pressed against the fence, their mouths open, screaming silently into the storm. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I clicked it on, its beam cutting a weak, trembling path through the oppressive dark. I swept the light across the gate. My heart stopped. In the brief, stark glare of my flashlight, I saw it. The massive padlock and chain were on the ground. And the gate, the great iron gate that was the final barrier, was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind. An invitation. A trap. They had used the storm, or maybe the storm was part of them. I didn't know. I didn't care. All I knew was that the final rule was about to be broken. The last line of defense was gone. Alistair's warnings, the ledger, Miller's final words. It all swirled in my head. Stay in the shack. They're planted. Don't let them wake up. But another thought pushed its way through the terror. This was my chance. A way out. Not just from the garden, but from the slow, agonizing death of being its caretaker. I wasn't going to die in this box. I wasn't going to be the next frantic entry in a forgotten book. With a strangled sob, I made my choice. I kicked open the door of the shack and ran. I broke rule number 1, leaving the safety of my prison. I sprinted through the lashing rain, my feet slipping in the mud. I didn't look at the figures pressed against the fence, though I could feel their collective gaze on me, a pressure on my skin. I reached the open gate and scrambled through the gap, my jacket tearing on the rusted iron. I was out. I was free. I ran for my car, my lungs burning, the rain plastering my hair to my face. As I fumbled for my keys, I risked one last glance back at the cemetery. The gate was swinging wider now, and from the dark, open maw of St. Jude's Garden of Repose, a sound began to emerge. It wasn't the whispers. It wasn't the crying. It was a low, resonant hum. It was a deep, geological sound, like a great stone door grinding open miles beneath the earth. It was the sound of a long, deep breath being taken after a century of sleep. The ground beneath my feet vibrated with it. It was the sound of the dream ending. I didn't wait to hear what came next. I threw myself into my car, the engine catching on the third try with a desperate roar. I slammed it into reverse and sped away, back down the muddy track, away from that place. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I couldn't. I just drove. I abandoned my post. I left the gate open. I didn't just quit a job. I let something out. The hitchhiker fell silent. His story hung in the air of the cab, thick and heavy like the fog outside. He stared ahead, his face pale in the dashboard lights, his eyes seeing something other than the road. "So you've been on the run ever since," I said. It wasn't a question. "Every day," he whispered. I read the papers, online news from those little Oregon towns, looking for strange reports, unexplained disappearances, entire families vanishing from their homes. I find them sometimes. Small articles buried on page 6, a family of 4 gone from a campsite near Mount Hood, a logging crew that never checked in. The official stories are always plausible: gas leaks, animal attacks, people just walking away from their lives. But I know what it really is. The harvest has begun. We drove in silence for another few miles. The sign for a small, nameless town appeared in the headlights. "Here is fine," he said, his voice flat. "Anywhere is fine." I pulled over to the gravel shoulder, the engine idling. He didn't move to get out right away. He just sat there, a man hollowed out by his own story. "Do you ever think about going back?" I asked quietly. He finally turned to look at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something in his dead eyes. It was a sliver of pure, undiluted terror. "Every night, I hear that hum in my sleep," he said. "And I know, as sure as I'm sitting here, that whatever woke up that night, it remembers the lullaby." and it's looking for the one who stopped singing. He opened the door, grabbed his duffel bag from the back, and stepped out into the misty darkness. He didn't say thank you or goodbye. He just melted into the fog and was gone. I sat there for a long time, the only sound the gentle rhythm of my windshield wipers. Then I put the car in drive.